Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Open University event, Reading in a Pandemic, as part of the 2021 Imagine Belfast Festival of Ideas and Politics. My name's John Darcy, and I'm the Director of the Open University in Ireland, and we're once again delighted to partner with Imagine Belfast to facilitate interesting discussions. This particular event is now a popular staple in the Imagine Belfast calendar and is in the 6th year of running that we've been joined by Shafquat Towheed and his colleagues to deliver this popular event. So this evening we'll be joined by Shaf and Maya Parmar, who will guide you through some extracts of literary works that we've turned to during this pandemic for reassurance, contemplation, or indeed escape. Shaf is a senior lecturer in English in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and Maya is a postdoctoral research associate in English literature, and they're both at the Open University. They'll be joined this evening by Dr Heather Richardson, a senior lecturer in creative writing at the Open University, and by Ella Berthoud, a bibliotherapist with a strong expertise in the field of well-being and reading. Now, before I hand over to Shaf, please do get involved both in the chat but also on social media, and feel free to post your thoughts about this event on Twitter. The OU's Twitter handle is @OUBelfast. And remember that the Imagine Festival hashtag is #ImagineBelfast. That's self-explanatory in many ways. So we'd love to see your posts and engage with you on the chat as well. So that's more than enough for me. And now I'd like to hand over to Shaf, Maya, Heather, and Ella.
Thank you so much, John, for that very generous introduction. And thank you everyone for coming this evening. Just to say, throughout the event, please feel free to post in chat as we go through the running order of the event this evening. Just to say, we'll start with a little mini lecture from me, and then I'm going to be joined in conversation with Ella and with Heather. We're going to talk through some ideas about reading recommendations in the pandemic. And then in the final section of tonight's event, Maya is going to be demonstrating ways in which you can share your experiences of reading in the pandemic with the Read It project. Okay, I think I shall start on my talk for this evening, which is titled Reading in the Pandemic. Over the course of the last 12 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has turned our lives upside down, and many of our most natural instincts have been suppressed. Pandemic social distancing rules have cut us off from participatory culture, from sport, and from social life, and it's responsible for a surging mental health crisis. Never has reading matter, specifically having books at home, been of greater importance. Confined to our homes, many of us have turned to the printed books on our shelves or the e-books on our digital devices for reassurance, for reflection, or for escape. In the pre-coronavirus world, I had never imagined that my current research at the Open University on the history of books and reading would be so close to home for so many people, including myself. Despite the surge in digital cultural consumption via Netflix, which added 16 million new subscribers in the first 3 months of 2020, and despite the repeated closure of bookshops and libraries for being non-essential businesses, reading has held its own during this global lockdown. In the first few months of the pandemic, the motivation for a lot of readers was predictably immersive. Readers have looked to earlier accounts of quarantine to make sense of an inherently disorientating experience. So initially, I think sales of pestilential classics like Camus' The Plague, published in 1947, or Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, first published in 1722. Sales of these books surged, and Marcel Theroux quite wittily commented that these books had gone the way of dried pasta and toilet roll in the first few months of the pandemic. And this was despite the fact that Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, for example, is out of copyright and freely available online. Both of these books became virtual book club and reading group favorites at the start of the outbreak. Camus, for example, was promoted by the French Embassy's Albertine Club, that's their reading group, by Seattle's The Stranger, which runs this wonderful silent reading party quarantine club online, and also by the YouTube vlogger Better Than Food, promoted Camus' The Plague, and I think it had 55,000 views in the first 11 months. Early on in the pandemic, Defoe's factual fictional novel, A Journal of the Plague Year, was picked up by The Guardian. It was their reading group choice for May 2020. It was also picked up by the Silent Book Club and even by the futurist commentator Brian Alexander. I think what this demonstrates is our inherent need, both as humans and readers, for shared collective experiences, mediated via text, to make sense of extreme upheaval. We look to books that have narrated or fictionalized the experience of past pandemics to make sense of a current one. I wonder if novels or short stories about vaccines and vaccination will enjoy a similar new momentary surge in interest this year. We'll find out soon enough. But not all reading during times of mental anguish or physical danger is immersive. Indeed, the contrary impulse to escape into something altogether more secure and predictable is a much more common response. We're a year into the pandemic now, and many of us are sick and tired of anything to do with plagues, infection, R numbers, border closures, self-isolation, or indeed that staple of science fiction, the post-apocalypse dystopian future. And for Belfast audiences, I'm not even going to mention the B word. Well, there are two of them, but I won't mention either. Many of us are yearning for a bit of normality and some of the simpler things of life. Writing in The Guardian, the commentator Josephine Tovey, in her article Sense and Social Distancing, noticed how the first pandemic lockdown gave her a newfound affinity with Jane Austen's heroines, their lives shaped by domestic confinement and social inhibition. Rather like Miss Bingley's exhortation to Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, those of us who've been self-isolating or shielding and are confined to our homes are encouraged to take a turn about the room to refresh ourselves. What this account of rereading a classic novel reminds us of is that returning to an old and familiar book can have a particularly strong restorative power. As evidence from the UK Reading Experience database demonstrates, readers have been finding solace, both comfort and escape, by reading the novels of Jane Austen for more than 2 centuries. Old habits like these, I think, stay with us through a crisis. Reading can be a way of helping us to adjust to a new normal. At a time of upheaval, reading can contribute to our mental well-being through positive emotional affect. Many of us have habitually turned to our favorite books at times of illness, solitude, or mental upset, because reading can provide both a means to temporarily escape our current circumstances, but also a way of understanding them and ourselves better. But what about the books themselves? Despite our increasingly, almost exhaustively online lives, the material book is now firmly back in focus, and not just as a backdrop to endless Zoom meetings like this evening's. Peering into our hastily assembled home offices, the wittily parodic and highly insightful Twitter account Bookcase Credibility has amassed over 118,000 followers since it was first set up in April 2020. Do you go and have a look at it? It's really very interesting. In our quarantine confined, digitally mediated existence, we literally are what we read, and our cultural capital is now on display to the whole world in material form. As the journalist Amanda Hess noted in the New York Times, the Credibility bookcase is the quarantine's hottest accessory, and one that cannot be counterfeited with ebooks. In the semiotics of the pandemic, the well-curated bookshelf has become a manifestation of our mental state, and perhaps for the first time during this barbarous interlude in human history, our books really are more important than our hair. And yet, this newly respectable flaunting of cultural capital can entrench existing socioeconomic inequalities. The personal library has always been an overt display of wealth as well as of knowledge. Not all of us are lucky or privileged enough to own or buy a large number of books and read our way through a pandemic. With libraries and charity shops closed for long periods, many readers' long-established habits of borrowing library books for free or picking up cheap second-hand books from charity shops have now been thwarted. Book poverty has become a pressing issue. So too has the digital divide. For tech-savvy readers, ebooks, audiobooks, and online ordering have facilitated their reading during the pandemic at the touch of a button. But sadly, for those on the other side of the digital divide, old habits of borrowing books have largely stopped, while new opportunities have not opened up. The footballer Marcus Rashford's highly successful campaign last summer to provide free meals to children outside of term time is now being supplemented by a free book campaign. Hungry children need food for their minds, as well as for their bodies. And to add to all of that, we have time poverty, juggling working from home, homeschooling, caring responsibilities, social distancing rules, and housework. Many of us are simply too exhausted to find the time to read as much as we would like. Exactly a year on from the first pandemic lockdown, now is a good time to reflect. It has been a tumultuous 12 months. We've had clap for carers and the rule of six, eat out to help out, travel corridors, red zones and social bubbles, homeschooling and pub closures, Zoom funerals, and babies born who've yet to meet their grandparents. And yet, we still have books to read, and reading continues to help us make sense of the world, learn about ourselves, and provide continuity and reassurance during periods of upheaval. While the pandemic has brought many challenges and much suffering, it is also a unique historical moment. Years from now, future generations who have yet to be born will likely ask us, the COVID-19 generation, this question. So, just what did you read during the age of the pandemic? I hope you've all got answers. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the first part of this event. I'm now going to invite Ella and Heather to join me in conversation. And please feel free to add in your suggestions and responses to some of the questions I'm going to ask Ella and Heather in the chat box, because I think that's always great. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I should probably just introduce you both briefly again, just to say Ella Berthoud is a bibliotherapist. She's a real life book doctor. So she works to recommend reading to help people, I guess, deal with various emotional and psychological issues. And so she will have a long list of possible book prescriptions, and she's going to talk through some of them. And Heather Richardson is a creative writer and novelist, so I think she will have a writer's perspective on reading during the pandemic. And I'm delighted you can both join us this evening. I'm going to start off with a question for you, Ella, if that's all right. I think lots of people have been sort of reading to try and make sense of all these enormous changes that have occurred during the pandemic. I mean, I know I read Camus' The Plague last summer. I'd read it before many years ago, but I reread it last summer in the light of the pandemic. And I know other people have been reading books dealing with plagues and infections. So what books would you suggest could help us make sense of the pandemic or of the lockdown or of quarantine?
So I've got three suggestions. One of my favorite pandemic books is Blindness by Jose Saramago, the Portuguese author, which is written in a kind of stream of consciousness, and it's all about a plague of blindness in which a doctor wakes up blind, and then whenever he comes into contact with anyone else, they become blind as well. So the authorities lock everyone away into special places because they're terrified of the pandemic spreading. So it's an extreme version of sort of the worst kind of pandemic. But the reason why I think it's a great read and not an entirely depressing one is because it is also a love story, and it's a tale of the doctor and his wife and how they survive this awful situation. It does go through some quite grim moments, but it is essentially an optimistic story, although it does also show you the worst of humanity at times. So that's a kind of downside, but really interesting. Another one that's more of a lovely read, but great, is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which I know lots of people have been reading during the pandemic, because it's about a man who is effectively quarantined for 30 years in a hotel in Moscow, and he's put there because he's under house arrest. But it's a really beautiful, delightful read, which shows how you can actually make the best of difficult circumstances. And his living quarters get smaller and smaller over the 30 years. He starts off with sort of a palatial residence because he's count, and then he slowly ends up in a kind of box room. But it's all about the strange relationships that he makes with people in the hotel, just like we are doing perhaps with neighbours that we've never spoken to, or people that we're talking to much more on Zoom. So I think it's a book you can really relate to. And then the third one, which I think has been a great success during lockdown and I've loved reading, is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is, I think, another wonderful metaphor for being in quarantine, because the hero, Piranesi, is stuck in this kind of parallel world. I don't want to say too much about it for people that haven't read it, because it's such a lovely book. Shaf, have you read it?
No, not yet. I mean, it's on my to-do list.
Yeah, I totally recommend it, because it's unlike any other book. It's very surprising. It's been described by many people as a puzzle and boxes within boxes. And you do spend the first probably 20 or 30 pages thinking, what on earth is this book about? I'm never gonna get to grips with it. And then it totally draws you in. And by the time you finished it, you're completely drawn into that world and you actually want to go back to that world. And I think it's really brilliant on the whole paradox between what being stuck, feeling stuck, but then also kind of loving your prison, which is perhaps what many of us are in that kind of situation. We might now be feeling a little bit scared of coming out of our prisons.
I mean, I hope none of us have to face 30 years in quarantine. I mean, that's quite sobering, isn't it? That sort of length of house arrest. I'm going to bring Heather into the discussion now, but just to say to participants, I mean, feel free to post your responses to these questions as well in chat. It would be lovely to hear your responses as well. Heather, I think I've got a question around big books. So I have struggled with concentration during this pandemic. I really have. I know I'm not alone. Lots of other people have had this problem where, you know, you think a big book is going to solve your, you know, dealing with the everyday crisis of the pandemic, but I've struggled with long books over the last 12 months because I just find it really difficult to get into that headspace of a big immersive read with all the kind of distraction going on. So what would you suggest that I do? You know, what could help with in terms of a strategy, or any particular big book that you would recommend? And I know obviously you're a novelist, so you have that consciousness of the length of a novel and how immersive it should be. So what would you suggest? What are your recommendations?
Yes, I mean, you're certainly not alone in having the problem with concentrating and delving into big books, because I've actually found that my reading has gone downhill quite drastically through the lockdown, because it's nearly so, you know, if you're sort of standing beside a swimming pool and you know it's going to be really cold to jump in, and you really kind of have to force yourself to do it. So I felt like that with books. I've sort of been standing at the edge, and mostly I haven't forced myself to get in, because I hope Ella will approve of the strategy, you know, but I'm trying to do the self-kindness thing. So like, don't beat yourself up too much if you can't face a big read. But I have done 2 big reads. One of which I think appeared on some of the slides that were appearing there, which is The Mirror and the Light, which is the first book that I've ever pre-ordered. So obviously I was looking forward to it long before COVID was a twinkle in Mother Nature's eye. And that was a tremendous experience during pandemic. I can't remember exactly when it came out. I think it was quite early into the pandemic. And I suppose, like a lot of fans of the Wolf Hall trilogy, you know, I've been really enjoyed the first 2 books. I've been really looking forward with a kind of sense to this final one, because you know, spoiler alert, it doesn't end too well for our hero. And it was such a relief to read it during those first months of the pandemic, because it is this amazingly immersive world that Mantell has created. It's not a world that I don't think any of us would particularly want to live in. So there is that kind of sense that, well, COVID and lockdown's pretty bad, but it would be a heck of a lot worse if we were living in trying to survive in the Tudor court. So that was, you know, I think that's one that if that's your kind of book, and you've read the other 2, it's definitely worth jumping into that particular swimming pool. And And the other one which I read, and I'm really so impressed by people sort of showing all these kind of new books that have come out that they've read, because I'm always really late to every party when it comes to reading. So I finally got around to reading the the Poisonwood Bible, Poisonwood Bible, years and years and years after it came out, because we're meant to be reading it for our Open University in Ireland book club. And I think because I had it on the Kindle, it's less daunting, because yes, you can see that little percentage thing at the bottom of the page, but it's not like having a huge doorstop of a book. And I think in the same way as The Mirror and the Light, it was an immersive experience to read it. Took a little bit of time to kind of get into it, but once you're there, you're transported to a very different place and time that's getting darker and darker as it goes along. And Kingsolver, of course, is a very intelligent writer. She's not giving you any kind of like, happy endings and jolly resolutions. It's very kind of real in that way, but that was a tremendous experience. So those were the two I suppose tips. Is one is give the mirror and the light a go, but also your Kindle may be your friend if you're kind of scared off by a great big book.
That's really interesting. I love your analogy in terms of the swimming pool as well, sort of that fear of wanting to plunge in, but actually is good for you, isn't it? And I think there is that sense that a long immersive read can do things for you that few other things can, that it really does transport you. And I think particularly, the Tudor court with its own constraints and its own kind of suffocating pressures, it kind of makes you feel happy for what you have, I guess, right? I'm going to bring Ella into this question as well, actually. So, I think same question for you, Ella. So what would you suggest in terms of dealing with distractions and big books, and any particular strategies, any big books that you would recommend, or any ways of reading that you would recommend during the pandemic?
Well, one thing I often recommend to my bibliotherapy clients is to create a reading nook in their house, if possible. So you can see behind me, I've got my lovely hanging chair, which is my reading nook, which I sometimes put a blanket over so that I'm completely cocooned in it. And I know that when I go there, I'm just going to read, and anyone else in the house also knows that's where I'm reading. So hopefully they won't disturb me. And I think obviously that's come to me quite recently in my life, but before I had that, I would just have a particular cushion that would be my reading cushion. So it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a fancy chair, but if it's a place where you go to read, I think it really helps for you to psychologically get into reading and not be distracted by the outer world. It could also be a cozy blanket that you wrap yourself in while you're reading. Turn off the Wi-Fi while you're reading, turn off your phone. So make a date with yourself, say, okay, 5 o'clock, I'm going to read for 20 minutes. Even if it is only 20 minutes, that's better than nothing. And I think if we all did that every day, then it's amazing how much you get through. Obviously, if you can read for an hour or more, all the better. But I think having those habits, both in terms of geography within your house and turning off the phone, really helps. And also giving signals to other people if you live with other people so that they won't disturb you. And if you do live on your own, then it's giving signals by turning off your phone. It may be even sending out a tweet or notice saying, I'm reading for the next half an hour, don't disturb me. And I think that really helps. And then in terms of other long books, I'd just like to recommend a great tome, which I think is perfect reading for the pandemic, Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec. And the reason it's great, apart from the brilliant writing, is that it's in bite-sized chunks. So in a way, it's the opposite of something like the Poisonwood Bible, which I do absolutely love and think is a brilliant immersive read. This is one where you can read a chapter in about probably 20 minutes. So it's actually a perfect book to just read in little chunks every day. And each chapter is a little story. It's all set in a block of flats in Paris, and it tells the story of everyone in the block of flats. It's a mad book. I don't know if you know it, but it's full of lists. It describes people's apartments, exactly all the objects within their apartment. It's a very kind of ludic book. It's full of games. It's written as if it's a kind of chessboard. It's got lots of kind of mad maths behind the way it's written. But besides all that, it's also just a great story full of lots of myths and tales. So it's a really good read and a nice tome to accompany you through a few weeks.
I mean, I do like that, you know, sort of novels that are set in a particular building. I mean, one of my favorites is Al-Aswani's The Yokubian Building, which is, you know, set in this Cairo apartment block. And, you know, actually, in some senses, the apartment block is the sort of central character of the novel. You know, has a life of its own, and you sort of get to know everyone else's private life in all sorts of odd ways, don't you? Which I think, particularly in this era when household visiting has been so restricted and household mixing has been so restricted, I suppose gives us a sense of community. I mean, I think that advice about switching off the Wi-Fi is a terrifically good one, by the way. I know, you know, libraries and other places have often, train carriages, for example, have often had quiet spaces where, you know, where you are allowed to think and read and contemplate. And I think perhaps we need something like the equivalent of a digital quiet space, you know, the kind of reading hour, which is mandated when Wi-Fi and email is just off for half an hour or an hour, so you can think and read and contemplate. That's all really good advice. I'm going to sort of reverse this question a little bit. I'm going to again ask both of you about this. I might ask you, Heather, if that's okay. So I'm just going to think about small bite-sized reading. So I mean, I know lots of us have been sort of juggling various things in our lives, you know, working from home, caring duties, endless online meetings, you know, homeschooling, childcare, all these other things. And sometimes we've only got little short bursts of time to read. So what would you suggest for shorter works? I mean, fiction, poetry, anthologies, you know, that's good for sort of 10 or 15-minute burst.
Yes, probably not fiction or poetry, actually. I mean, I've found over this period, I've been reading quite a lot of non-fiction, and particularly things that are biographical, but not sort of, you know, the traditional, you know, biography or kind of memoir thing. And that kind of lends itself quite well to that. A couple of ones that I enjoyed over lockdown. One is Derek Jarman's Modern Nature. So Derek Jarman is the filmmaker who also famously created this amazing garden in Dungeness, out of sort of in the shadow of Dungeness nuclear power station, and quite sort of unpromising ground. And he wrote Modern Nature is kind of as a couple of years worth of his diaries that he wrote in the I think it was the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And it's really very much as a genuine diary is. It's a real mixture of, you know, got some new plants and put them in, and there's a Sun journalist who's been sneaking around the house trying to take photographs of me, and you know, then all his kind of traumas and trying to get funding for films being made. But because it's a diary, it's actually, you can just say, do you know what, I'm only going to read 2 days worth today. And he does, because he was an amazingly creative person. It's interspersed with bits of poetry. And I think what's interesting as well about it is this was the period, you know, when the AIDS epidemic was really kind of, it was a terrible sort of cull of people and of his friendship group. And there was rarely a day went past that he wasn't getting bad news or distressing news. And at the same time, very worried about his own health, you know, and every little chill or whatever was a cause of deep concern. So it was sort of, I think there was that sense, there's a comfort in it in a way, in that he was taking such delight and comfort in nature, which is, you know, I think is good for us all. And I think this pandemic, you know, we've all been very aware of that, but also that, you know, that sense of perspective that you get from the distance of time. That, I mean, that was an appalling time, you know, and a terrible time for humanity, I suppose, which is, you know, and there's been such tremendous progress made now. So we're in a difficult time. And of course, I've had this marvelously kind of compressed progress in terms of dealing with the disease. So I think there's something great about the perspective of reading something which, although it's not the main theme of the thing, you know, it gives you a sort of a different view on these things. And as I say, because it's a diary, it's little chunks. The other book that I've enjoyed particularly over this time is actually by a visual artist, because everybody took up their new hobby in the first lockdown. You remember that lovely sunny lockdown, you know, where you could do stuff outside? So I decided to start dabbling with painting again and started listening to lots of podcasts and things like that, and got the garden shed converted into my little art room. Then of course winter came and I had to retreat. But this was a lovely book by an American abstract landscape artist called Brian Rittenberg, called Clear Seeing Space. And he's a beautiful writer, you know, and the chapters are just tiny little mini essays on life, on being an artist of any kind, being any kind of creative, and sort of drawing very much on his upbringing on the South Carolina coast, this sort of very lush kind of amazing place, and his current life in New York. And it's just one of those ones I was just dipping into it this morning. I've read it obviously cover to cover, but you can just dip into a random chapter, which might only be a couple of pages long, and just get a little kind of, you know, a little injection of something nourishing for the day.
I did find myself reading Second World War diaries right at the beginning of the first lockdown, which was kind of wonderful, the parallels. And I mean, there were things that were similar and things that were very dissimilar, but that the texture of the lived experience was really actually curiously reassuring. So I think that's quite a good bit of advice. And Ella, I'm wondering if I can ask you the same question. Any short reads? Any if you've got 10 minutes per day, and you're pressed for time, what would you recommend for short reads?
There's a couple of books that come to mind. There's Some by David Eagleman, which is short stories. The subtitle is 40 Tales from the Afterlives, which sounds like it's going to be depressing, but no, it's actually really celebrating life. It's all about ideas of the afterlife, which are playful and commenting really on how you live your life. So for instance, one of the stories is all about how in the afterlife you have to relive your life in chunks. So you spend 15 years eating meals, you spend 2 years sitting on the loo, you spend 3 years waiting at a bus stop, you have 10 minutes of pure joy, etc. So it makes the comment that, isn't it great that actually we do get to live our lives in a much more intermingled way. And they're lovely stories. They're actually great to read aloud, which is something that I often recommend to people as well, whether it's someone that you live with, which is obviously lovely, but also it could be that you read aloud with someone over Zoom if you're having a long distance relationship, or if it's a relative or a friend. That's a great way of connecting over a book, because we often don't necessarily have so much to talk about these days because there's not a lot going on. So if you can actually share reading a short story, that's a great way of connecting. And then another one, which is in a way the opposite extreme of this, is more short stories, Love in Colour by Bolu Babalola. And these are short stories based on worldwide myths. So they're myths like Cupid and Psyche, lots of Pyramus and Thisbe, Nefertiti, Scheherazade, and they're all retellings of these stories. And I love them because they're very positive retellings. They're very feminist, they're very empowering, and they're surprising as well. So you're reading a story like Cupid and Psyche and you're thinking, oh God, it's all going to end in doom. But actually there's an unexpected twist, and she rewrites the stories as if they are set now as well. So they're really inventive and playful and fun and lovely. You can read them in a short burst of 10 minutes. So I think they're a great companion as well, and only just out, so all the more exciting.
Great recommendation. So we've got a sort of final question for this discussion part, and I'm going to ask both of you this question. So this is about sort of serendipity. I mean, a lot of us haven't been able to access, books in libraries, or go to bookshops, or go to cafes, and so we've had to turn to the books that we've got. that have been lurking on our shelves, and sometimes there have been, it's the usual to-do list of books you've put away waiting to read. And now some of us have had a bit of time to be able to do it, but have you discovered or rediscovered a book sitting on your shelf for ages that you finally managed to read? So was there a discovery? Ella, you first, and then Heather.
The one that I discovered that had been sitting on my shelf, which I think I'd ordered a while back thinking, ooh, that looks fun, and then never got round to reading, is A Curious Invitation by Suzette Field, which is a really lovely compilation of descriptions of parties from literature. So it's really nicely put together, and it takes parties from, for instance, The Great Gatsby, Edgar Allan Poe's The Red Mask, The Mask of the Red Death. There's a Roman party from the earliest times, Trimalchio's dinner party. So it's parties from literature over the ages, and she describes the setup, the guests, the food, the conversation, and it makes for brilliant reading, because at this time when we're all missing social situations, we can have a vicarious party through that book. So I'm loving dipping into that, and that's one which has just been sitting on my shelf for a while, and I serendipitously picked it up, but I really recommend it as a great read for now.
Heather, what have you found? I know you've definitely found something that you're going to share with us.
Yes, yeah, not on my own bookshelf, because my own bookshelf, it's been standing by the swimming pool. I'm thinking, I know I really enjoyed that swim, but I just can't face going back into it again. So all the books that I've sort of, thought to reach for as a kind of comfort read, I just somehow couldn't bring myself to do it. But I'm very lucky that my 20-year-old son, who unluckily for him is stuck at home at the moment rather than being at university, he's a voracious reader, and also a voracious viewer of vlogs, and is really up to speed with everything that's going on in the world of books, particularly young adult and new adult books. So he tends to be the person that I go to when I say, I don't know what to read, what can I read? So one that he sort of suggested to me is this book, which it's very much a kind of, it's a sort of like future world, space, planets, terrible things going on, lots of evil plots and so on. But it's very sort of experimental in the way it's done. There's lots of illustrations and kind of bits of, dialogue written out, like kind of transcripts and so on, and I love that kind of stuff. I find it just quite, it's sort of like reading in 3 dimensions, when you've got all these different ways of doing it. So that's a book. I think if you've got other readers in your house of whatever age, it's really good to kind of take some tips from them and maybe read something you would never in a million years pick up and read in a bookshop, because it broadens your horizons. And the nice thing is that then we have very, very long chats about it, because he really does analyze these things. So that's great as well, because that's building a bit of kind of companionship, I think, into the reading process.
Oh, that's really good advice. So I think we're coming to an end to this part of the discussion. So please join me in thanking Ella and Heather. Ella and Heather, please stay with us, because we'll be quite happy to have your contributions as well. And I'm going to hand over to Maya. Thank you very much, Ella and Heather, for your suggestions. And Maya's going to tell us about how you can share your experiences of reading during the pandemic with the Read It Research Project. Maya, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Maya Parmar. I also work on the Read It project at the Open University. I should thank Ella, Heather and Shaf for that really interesting chat. I always love this idea of a reading nook. I think it's fantastic, because we always think of how we can designate some time to do our reading. We're going to do a little bit of reading before bed, cut down on the TV, for example, but the idea of designating an actual physical space, it seems to me really liberating, but also a really useful enabling idea. So that's one that I'm going to be trying to kind of put into practice. So we're moving to the final section of our event, and we've got a PowerPoint presentation. Emma, is it possible to say that? Thank you so much. So you can see the running order on there. What I'm going to be doing during this session is sharing a number of project resources. And these are ways that you can talk to us at the Read It project and talk to us about your reading. So I'm going to be showing you our contribution portal, our project postcards, and the chatbot. And ultimately what we'd like to do is hear from you guys about your everyday reading, about your reading during the pandemic as well. And you can do that, you can talk to us through the chat function. I know some of you have already been using that chat function. We've had someone respond to Heather's idea of this, of kind of reading being like a swimming pool, and someone's kind of responded to that and kind of said, you know, the idea of climbing out of that pool after an immersive read. She can relate to that. It's kind of this, she feels like a sense of loss. So yeah, any comments like that responding to what we're talking about, please do get in touch, and we'll pick up some more of the other comments as we kind of move through the presentation. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please, Emma? So first and foremost, I'd like to show you our project postcards. So our resources on the project are there to help us learn about your reading habits, your experiences, your memories. And the first thing I'm going to show you is our project postcards. So this is what they look like. They seem to be appearing upside down. You can see that there are 5 of them. And what we do is you request these from us and we send them out to you as a pack. So you will get 5 postcards, each containing a question each, and each of them has a space on there for you to populate a answer in response to one of the questions that you'll see on the postcards. As I've suggested, these can be requested from either Shaf or myself on the project, and we will send them out to you. You might like to write to us, you can email us, you can give us a call, talk to us on Twitter, any way you like, and we'll get one of these packs or several of them sent out to you depending on what you'd like. And it's up to you then to populate the questions. We'll have a look at some example questions in a minute, and you'll also receive from us a stamped address envelope in which you just pop the cards once you've populated them and send them back to us. If you don't want to do that, you can also use a QR code upload, and there are some instructions on how to do that. So you don't need to send anything out in the post, you can just do it using your computer. So the postcards that I've showcased there are in English. You can see, I think on the screen, the example there is in German. We have them available in a range of languages because our project is a pan-European project. So they are also available in Czech, Italian, French, and Dutch. And I should say, you don't need to write anything on here. You might like to put a little doodle in response to it. So we encourage a range of responses, non-textual responses as well, in answer to the questions. And as I've said, we are happy to send out a single one of those packs, as well as larger numbers. Say you're part of a reading group, or perhaps you have family members that might like to contribute. We can send out several of the packs. Okay, well, I've shown you the postcards. Let's have a look at some of the questions, and let's do a demonstration of them. Shaf's going to join us now, and he's going to respond to some of the questions. And it'd be great, actually, if anybody wanted to respond in the chat to some of these questions. Hi, Shaf. So on screen, you should be able to see three questions by way of example. So these are example questions of what you might see on the postcards. They are example questions of what you might see on our contribution portal, and I'll take you through the contribution portal in a moment. So let's have a little read of the first question. During periods of lockdown, during the COVID-19 pandemic, reading has often been a way of escaping the current situation. What have you read today? So I'm going to ask Shaf to respond to this. I have a feeling he might have had a prepared answer ready for us. And of course, I ask you out there, you guys who are listening, to also respond to this in chat, and we can pick up some of those responses. So Shaf, did you have any thoughts about that first question?
I have indeed, and just to say, please feel free to put your responses to that first question in the chat box as well. I've been a bit Blue Peter, so I've done my little postcard, and it's not something I read today, but it's something I've just finished reading, so I think it applies for this question. And it's Muriel Spark's novel Symposium, which is actually about, and here it is, which is actually about a dinner party. It's a North London dinner party with 5 couples. So it starts off, I guess, like Plato's Symposium, philosophical discussion around the dinner table. But actually, as you'd expect with Muriel Spark, it's actually quite dark. And there's a sort of element of Scottish crime noir behind it all. So there's all sorts of double dealing and death and faked wills and forgery and various other things going on behind it. And it's a really, really good read. I mean, I absolutely loved it. It's very much of its time. So think London in the 80s is when it's late 80s is when it's set. So if you're old enough and you remember that period in history, then you'll probably get even more from it. But that's the most recent thing I've read. Maya, did you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, we've kind of had someone raise a point about this idea of COVID pandemic reading, about returning to familiar and undemanding books. For example, I think a couple of people have described trying to read or getting on better with crime fiction, and someone's described the sense of kind of security at the end of it. I'm currently reading this book. This is a non-fiction, so for me, I fall into the category of that party of people that are a bit time poor at the moment. They've got childcare responsibilities, they need some stimulation, so that's why I'm going for something non-fiction. But the progress is incredibly slow with this, I'm afraid. So I might get a page here, I might get a page there, but currently the chapter I'm reading is Johnny Pitts is in Paris, and he's looking at African European culture in Paris, and it is transportative. It is really nice to kind of read it and be taken away for those few minutes that I can carve out. Let's have a look. What have we got other people saying in the chat? We'll move on to the next question in a moment.
There have been a few comments on the sort of pull of darkness and how actually reading things which are quite dark can be quite reassuring, which is a really good take, I think, on what reading can do for you.
Yeah, I suppose also in a time where you wake up in the morning and your day can look quite monotonous, actually that element of light and shade might be quite nice. Fantastic. Okay, well let's move on to another question. So again, this is an example of the questions that you will encounter on our postcards and on our contribution portal, also our chatbot, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So let's dive right in. So it's the second question that you should be able to see on the PowerPoint presentation. Has the COVID-19 pandemic made you think about your reading? Why do you read? Shaf, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have got lots of thoughts about that, and I have scribbled down some of them because I think the why do you read question is such a difficult one. And here's my postcard. And so I scribbled down, I read because I like to escape to another world, time or society. I read to travel via book and learn something new. I read to experience the world from another viewpoint. I read for comfort and reassurance by rereading, so a book that you really know, so you get the same satisfaction or even more satisfaction by reading it again. I read to pass the time. I read to feed my curiosity. If there's something I'm really curious about, I want to read about it. And also simply because there's so many books still waiting to be read. So that's also a kind of motivation to keep going, right? You're never going to conquer it, but you've got to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything particular that you're moving towards during the pandemic?
So, I mean, I can share a sort of memory of reading of something I've reread more than once, because I think it's absolutely brilliant. The first time I read it was over 25 years ago. It's Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia. Absolute travel classic, I know, I'm a bit of a cliche, but I think it's terrific. And particularly at a time when we can't go anywhere, it's kind of wonderful to read it again. He's got a great style, you know, it has all sorts of elements of fact and myth and fiction, and I still haven't been to Patagonia, despite the fact I first read this 25 years ago, but perhaps one day. So, you know, I think that's one of the great things about books. It can transport you even without being able to go somewhere in a really, really immersive way. I see lots of great comments in the chat. I think that's a great one about seeking out abroad in books.
Yeah,
that's beautiful way of thinking about what reading can do.
I think we might be doing that for quite some time, sadly. Let's have a look. Yeah.
I think quite a lot of references to classic crime fiction. I didn't mention one of the other things that I had read recently, but over Christmas I did read Georges Simenon and this book, A Maigre Christmas, which is fabulous, which is set in Paris over the Christmas holidays. And I read it in London over the Christmas holidays. And it's really good with the sort of minutiae of detail. And like all crime fiction, it kind of pulls you in because you want to know about how things are going to be solved. So it's taxing, but not too taxing. You know, it's not, you know, a kind of intellectually very deep read, but it's stimulating enough to offer the kind of diversion that you really, really want. So I can see why people are reading lots of crime fiction, even though we're stuck indoors not doing anything.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can resonate with that. Oh, and it looks like you've set some inspiration out there for Heather. Okay, I think we could probably talk about our reading for quite some time, but I'm conscious that we want to take a look at the contribution portal. So I'm going to move on to that. Thank you, Emma, for the next slide. And as you can see on screen now, there's a screenshot of our contribution portal. This is a version of the postcards, which I showed you earlier, and which Shaf kindly showed us a populated version of, that's available online. So it mimics our postcard packs. So what you do here is you'd log on using the URL that you can see on the screen. It's read-it.in-2.com. That's all that will be available on our website and our on our Twitter feed, if you don't quite catch that there. So you would log on to that URL and this page will pop up. There are again 5 questions which are randomly loaded up, so you'll be confronted with one of 5 questions randomly. And again, there's a space there for you to add your response to the questions, by example, we just looked at. And again, here we welcome, thanks, Shaf, for putting that in chat. We welcome responses, textual responses. So you might write something in response to the question, but you may also like to upload an image. We welcome both, either or. You can give us a textual response, or you might put a photo or an image up, or you can do both. And the really nice thing about the portal is that you can log on again and again. So you would log on, make an account, and respond to the questions. And you might find that you're getting the same question more than once, but you might find your responses actually different depending on what you're doing that day, how you're feeling about reading at that time. And so it's a really nice way of kind of sharing the way that you're reading, your experiences, your memories, and your habits. The portal is also available in a number of languages. So there's a toggle function at the top. So you might like to respond to the questions in Czech, Italian, French, German, or Dutch, as well as English. And one thing I should say is that these resources that I'm showcasing today, they're all anonymized. So all the information that you share with us is carefully stored and carefully looked after in an anonymous fashion. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the chatbot next. Thanks, Emma. So this is another project resource that we have, and this is a friendly method of engaging with a project and sharing your reading again, but you can do it through your mobile phone and have an interactive conversation with the project bot. So again, on the screen, you can see some images of the chatbot and what it would look like if you loaded it up. You can engage with the chatbot via Telegram, the app. So you download the Telegram app, you search for our bot, or you can use the QR code to find the bot. and you simply say hello, and the chatbot will ask you a question about reading, as well as giving you lots of resources on the project. If you don't want to download Telegram, you can also access the chatbot via the web. And there are a number of links for the chatbot because it's available in a number of languages. So it's available in English, French, Dutch, and Italian at the moment. And so if you want to find the links, go onto our website and you'll be able to find the relevant links for the relevant languages. So as I've said, you'll log on and you'll say hello to the chatbot, and it will talk to you about your reading. And if there's something that you don't like, or you want to move on, or you want to stop, you have all of those facilities to be able to do that with the chatbot. You can come back and you can re-engage with the chatbot later if that suits you as well. And this is a really nice tool actually to talk about your reading, because if you are time poor, you can engage with the chatbot very easily for 5 odd minutes, say on your mobile phone, and then you could come back to it later. Shaf, is there anything you wanted to add about the chatbot or the other resources?
I mean, just to say again, with all the data that's gathered through the chatbot, it's all anonymous, so we don't gather any kind of personal information at all. And the chatbot will re-engage with you. So if you've downloaded or accessed the chatbot through the Telegram app, and you'd had a conversation, it will contact you again automatically after a couple of days just to say hello. So and you can engage with it as you want. If you're not interested, just say next or stop, and it will stop. It's a really lovely light touch way of you being able to respond about your reading in the time that you see fit. So that's its purpose for existence.
Yeah, great. Okay. So there's just one thing to do before I move to thank you for joining us. We have an exciting podcast, a free podcast available by Professor Josie Billington. There's the information available on it on the screen right now. It's called Reading Doing Its Work, Shared Literature Lifelines. And it's by Professor Josie Billington, Department of English, University of Liverpool. And the podcast, it explores mental health and wellbeing through shared reading during the COVID-19 pandemic. The podcast, it's around 10 minutes long, and I would really recommend it if you've enjoyed today's session, because it builds on that, and it's a really rich talk. There's also, if you click on the link, there's a transcript available of the podcast at the same time, which might be helpful. Right, can I just grab the last slide? And finally, it's just left me to say thank you so much to our audience who have joined us today, as well as Ella and Heather and Josie Billington for providing that podcast for us. We've also had lots of help with behind the scenes facilitation from OU Belfast, from our colleagues John and Laura Dowie, who's behind the scenes I know as well. So we should thank them. And of course, thank you to Imagine Belfast for hosting us again. As John suggested, it's been many years that we've been here with you guys, so it's always a great pleasure. Stay in touch with us, the project, read it. We have a very active Twitter account. We tweet from @EUReadIt, so do join us, follow us, chat to us, request some postcard packs if that sounds of interest to you. The details are on screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat Josie Billington's her podcast, and I will hand it over back to Shaf now.
Thank you, Maya. And just to say again, thank you to Ella and Heather for joining us. Fantastic recommendations on reading. Thanks to John and to Emma for their facilitation and for introducing the session. Please do feel free to get in touch with us, request postcard packs. If you've got a reading group, for example, and you think they might be interested in sharing their reading at this moment, then let us know. We can have these sent out to your home addresses, so just give us a ring. And again, that's all done in a very secure and confidential fashion, so we don't store any personal data. And feel free again to engage with us in the digital realm as well, via Twitter, project website, and so on. Thanks again for joining this session. Hope you're having a really wonderful reading life through the pandemic. And I hope you find lots of really wonderful and interesting things on your bookshelves or on your e-devices that keep you going and keep you cheerful. Thanks again, and have a really, really good evening. Bye now.
Thanks, Shaf.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. That was a fascinating hour and a wonderful end to the day. Really, really good. And some great reaction in the chat. Thank you so much for everything. Great recommendations. I've scribbled them all down. So Kindle will be bulging at the end of this week when I hopefully get a lot of those.
Yeah, fantastic recommendations. Really, really, really good. And really varied, which is fantastic. There's something there for everyone, I think.
Yeah.
I'm going to read Muriel Spark now as well, the symposium. That sounds great. That should be in this book, probably. Sounds like. Okay, have a great evening, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks
likewise.
again, everyone. Take care.
Good to
Stay
speak again.
safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye.